Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. China is planning to raise the individual income tax threshold, and this aroused extensive attention from the society and beyond. The National People's Congress Standing Committee will reveal a draft law amendment to raise the monthly individual income tax exemption threshold to 5,000 yuan, or about $780 from the current 3,500 yuan, or about $550. And for the very first time, taxes will cover 4 income items. Several of other expenses have also been added, including money spent on education, medical treatment for serious illness, housing loan interest, and housing rent. Those are big concerns for residents of China's mega metropolises, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. For more on China's amendments to individual income taxes, we have in our Beijing studio Mr. Liu Zhiqin. He is a senior fellow of Chongyang Institute of Finance Studies of Renmin University. Also in Beijing, Mr. Fu Jun, professor from the School of Government at Peking University. And joining us in New York, Max Wolf, professor of economics in New School University. Professor Wolf, I want to begin with you. It's interesting to have some views coming from outside China. Many believe this is going to be a boost for spending for very average Chinese individuals. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Yes, I do think it's a wise policy. I think it's also fortuitously timed. I think whenever we talk about domestic or individual income taxes, we talk about 2 levers at the same time, and it's important to remember that. One lever has to do with growth. This will be stimulative of a higher growth rate in China, which I think is important. And the other one is redistributive. So this will also ease some pressures and allow lower income folks, or folks who make unspectacular but solid wages, to spend more, and that may come at an important time for the global economy, in which we see a pretty serious attacks on global free trade, and so domestic demand is more important to balance economies as the international community is in a period of tumult.
Professor Fu, do you think from within the country is that likely to happen?
Well, I think it's premature to say. The tax move change of tax from 3,000 to 500 to 5,000 is a step in the right direction. But personally, I think the magnitude of this move is not big enough. In nominal terms, it's an improvement, but in real terms, probably we stay where we were 7 years ago.
Mr. Liu, you see a lot of policy debates recently. Besides the likelihood of the threshold of personal income tax be raised from 3,500 to 5,000. There's also debates about whether the mortgage tax is likely to come into being after a long debate. There's also debate of the overall Chinese economy and where is it going. Do you think these debates is necessarily linked with one another?
I think so. It's necessary to link with each other. If we remind ourselves in the past years, 7 or 6 years, we have another term of the individual income tax reform. At that time, we see really a big boost of the consumption in China, especially by housing and education, and also traveling. The tourists are also booming from that time. I have to say this is one of the reasons, or one of the outcome of the tax cut reform that has good and a very potential, very positive result. So we can see that at this time that this reform will also have some similar outcome influence in the market. People are eager to buy and to consume.
At least that was the experience last time when they raised the threshold of the personal income tax. But having said that, though, personal income tax, if you change the tax rate or if you change the threshold, it also should have an impact about how different communities of this country would function. For example, the relatively richer, middle class, and also those who are of average income. So people wonder whether this is going to bring the society to a fairer place, meaning if you tax more to the one who earn a bit more, will there be a better picture of fairness, social fairness in a way? If you look at China's Gini coefficient, the rate of it is not very encouraging. So will this change that picture, at least to a certain extent? Professor Fu.
Well, there you are talking about two concepts. One is the wealth gap measured in terms of income. The other is the real wealth gap. It's asset-based. You mentioned Gini coefficient. There are two numbers. One is Gini coefficient in terms of income. The other is asset-based. The asset-based Gini coefficient is much higher than the income. That has something to do with the next move that China has to decide, because in the change of the current tax, there is an item called reduction in terms of mortgage rates. Now the details are yet to come out. Are you talking about mortgage rate deduction for the first-time buyer or second-time buyer?
We don't know it because the National People's Congress is still thinking about this new law, but
potentially,
yes.
Potentially that has deep implications whether or not we are going to narrow the wealth gap or widen the wealth gap. So when our MPC, the legislator, will be there to debate, they have to debate that point very seriously.
Right. Professor Wolf, 2 days ago, Chinese Central Bank Governor Yi Gang came out and faced the press. He was talking about stability of the Chinese economy. He's also been talking about the long term of the Chinese economy. So many of the things that we read today or we see today, the actions being taken possibly by the government and the legislators, have to be put into a much bigger context. As you mentioned, Professor Wolf, now we see China-U.S. trade dispute. Now we see international trade and economic structures likely even to change. And therefore, China's status, particularly regarding its economy, where it is going, is not clear. Meanwhile, you also see China needs to have more reform and opening up. It already has its agenda and roadmap. And what will be the impact of those changes? Not clear either. So you see that not just an income tax threshold change, but rather you see it in a much broader aspect, Professor Wolf.
Yeah, so absolutely. What this policy intervention or proposed policy intervention will do will shore up the finances and the ability to demand products internally, particularly for folks making between $3,500 and $7,000, right? So that will be the most affected groups. And then folks in the sort of range of $7,000 will be affected. And I think what you're seeing there is an ability to shore up their ability to purchase homes, to make rents, to be large buyers of goods and services domestically. That also frees up greater leverage for the Chinese government in international trade negotiations, and on the monetary policy side, to your point about Bank of China governance, it gives greater interest rate flexibility also because it's a fiscal policy stimulus that also safeguards households in and around that 3,500 to 7,000 range, which I think is a key structural middle class support range. So I think it's quite smart. It makes the government more capable to have policy flexibility in just those areas where things tend to be pretty unstable right now.
For those coming from big metropolises, for example, Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, 3,500 to 7,000 a month is not that big money. And yet, for those coming from third-tier cities and down, that's big money already. That's pretty much what people earn in those places. So obviously you see this is a, shall I say, unfrozen of the purchasing power coming from townships, coming from small cities, coming from the very basic layer of the Chinese society and the population, Mr. Liu.
Yes, you have a very good question. That's why it's difficult for us to talk in general about the fairness from this tax reform. You see, this is really different level, different cities, different groups. They have different feelings. You see, this is a big problem. So I think when we are talking about the outcome of this tax cut or the reform, we cannot separately or individually talking about the 5,000. Should be a combination of different policies. That whether this policy combined with other, for instance, the housing pricing and other, the living standard, the livelihood, the pricing, if the consumer products increasing, I think this individual tax cut will be digested by such a price inflation. So this is the point we have to pay attention.
Another point that really needs to be paid attention to is what is likely to, in a way, encourage people to spend. Professor Fu, you've been working on Chinese society for a long time. I mean, if you think about what people are having concern about, healthcare, education, and when they get old. That's what people are thinking about, mainly the safety net, in other words. Will establishing and further sharpen up of the best possibilities of the safety net vis-a-vis, I just say, do the cuts to, or rather raising up the threshold of personal income tax, which one is likely to provide people with freer spirit to spend?
Well,
can we have the best option?
Well, I want to make 2 points there. One point is that the way I look at the current change of the tax code is that Chinese culture has taken families very seriously. But institutionally, this is the right step to move from a individual-based tax to a more family-oriented tax, because you are talking about deductions on part of spending on education for your kids. This is a big move. In the long term, when you look at what demographics is going to set to decline, it's so important. The second point I want to make is, well, you have to make a choice between buying houses, if the house price continue to rise, and spending on other items. And there are two things you have to consider very seriously. Now, if the tax reduction is so minimum and the housing prices continue to rise, that probably will depress domestic consumption.
All right.
So we have to weigh the two ends very carefully and to make a judgment whether or not well, with this will boost
what is
consumption.
likely to be the result of it? Well, we talk about China's tax revenue. That has been on the rise, in fact, and the share of personal income tax, which is exactly our topic today, is rising with it. Here are some figures. In 2017, China total tax revenue a little short of 14.5 trillion yuan, and revenue from personal income tax around 1.2 trillion yuan, rising sharply by 18.6% compared to 2016. Individual income tax was the third largest contributor to China's total tax revenue, following value-added tax and enterprise income tax. So when you look at the overall package of taxes that is being levied now here in China, personal income tax is only one of those. There are a lot of debate also about tax reform as well. Professor Wolf, I'm sure as a Chinese observer, China observer, you have been hearing some of those. How is this likely to be one of those steps in the long journey of tax reform?
So to us, it looks like a maturation of the domestic economy, where the rate of investment and the top-line economic growth will probably structurally slow, largely because of the success of the Chinese economy at gaining the size and basic affluence that has been achieved. That usually means a pivot toward slightly more consumer-centric economy, where the consumption portion of GDP will rise, in part organically, and in part because the portion of the state spend, the portion of the investment spending needs to and is in the process of coming down. To the extent that individual consumption in China rises, it helps to offset lost markets overseas. It helps to give a little more control, and quite importantly, consumer decisions, consumer tax decisions matter more because consumption issues become a larger portion of the economy. So we think this is part of the maturation of a country that has become a higher income developed country and is now beginning to have tax and fiscal policy dynamics that reflect that reality.
How are we going to see the result of this? To what extent do you want to give the time and the space before we can conclude whether this is really working to a certain extent about the goals two gentlemen here in Beijing you have been illustrating? Mr. Liu, very briefly from you.
I think in 10 years in the future, I think that the whole system will be improved again, because at the moment this is only a very fundamental, very initial step is not the right absolute decision for such a reform because of the economic pressure from outside. We need more innovation, need more reform.
Inside, of course. Professor Fu,
well, in 10
go.
years, I think we need to have a clear direction, and I hope we'll have a clear direction. You have to balance between the role of state and the role of the market. And ultimately, I think we need to balance in favor of the market. And in terms of taxation, China should not think, the government of China should not think that tax is the only revenue through which you can build public works. There are other ways. PPP is one another. The other is for the state to issue treasury bonds, municipal bonds,
because
these are direct funding way of raising debts from the citizens. And if we do that, probably you have less a chance to end up with non-performing loans.
Well, there are a lot of different tools that could be of use, and there could be also different skill sets that should be applied to the use of those tools. But for now, I want to thank all of you for being with us, Liu Zhiqian, Fu Jun, and Max Wolf. Really appreciate, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.